What happened when an undercover CEO traded his title for dusty boots and discovered the silent struggles hidden inside his family's vineyard? Welcome, wise and thoughtful listeners. Your heart for true leadership and lasting legacy is exactly what the world needs more of. Today's story isn't just about business. It's about rediscovering what really matters when success starts to lose its soul. Stay with us as we dive into a journey of quiet courage, unexpected heroes, and the powerful reminder that the strongest roots grow where care and character are never forgotten. The morning mist clung low over Monroe estates, turning the vineyard rows into ghostly silhouettes against the awakening California sky. Caleb Monroe stood alone at the edge of the overlook where his grandparents once planned the future, his boots sinking slightly into the soft, damp earth. The smell of soil and sweet fermentation, once comforting, now felt heavy, like a memory too long ignored. He wrapped his arms across his chest, the weight of the years pressing against his ribs. His grandparents had built this land with bare hands and stubborn hearts, planting each vine like a promise to a better future. And now, decades later, Caleb realized he hadn't touched a vine in years. He'd been too busy chasing expansion plans, new markets, boardroom metrics, believing numbers could replace presence, that leadership could be measured in margins instead of moments. Lately, the numbers themselves had started to betray him. Complaints piling up, turnover climbing, guest reviews souring like a bad batch of Zinfandel. His managers had explanations, of course. Young workers were lazy now, no one wanted to stay, it was just the way things were. But standing there as the first rays of sun fractured across the vineyard hills, Caleb knew the truth cut deeper. It wasn't the workers who had changed, it was the leadership. It was him. Somewhere between the quarterly reports and executive dinners, he had lost the pulse of the land and the people who held it together when no one was watching. He stared down at the rows of vines stretching endlessly before him, each one still fighting, still rooted, despite the neglect. It wasn't too late. Not yet. But if he didn't act now, Monroe Estates would become just another forgotten family dream rotting from the inside out. Caleb inhaled the cold morning air, sharp with dew and regret, and made a decision he should have made long ago. No more distance. No more excuses. He would go himself. Not as the owner, not as the man who once gave speeches about tradition while missing the small cracks forming beneath his feet. He would go as a worker, as another pair of hands among the forgotten, and see the truth with his own eyes. The vineyard deserved that much. His grandparents deserved that much. And deep down, so did he. Caleb swapped his pressed slacks and loafers for worn jeans, a faded gray t-shirt, and steel-tube boots that still smelled faintly of the storage closet where he'd found them. He left his truck behind too, renting an old rust-scratched pickup with a rattling engine and a cracked windshield. If he wanted to see the truth, he couldn't look like the man who signed paychecks. He had to disappear into the background. Just another hired hand trying to make a buck. The drive up to Monroe Estates felt different from behind the battered steering wheel. The majestic front gates, once a source of pride, were now crooked on their hinges, one side dragging slightly on the ground. The signature white stucco tasting room, centerpiece of the estate, looked worn and tired in the morning light. Paint chipped, banners faded to near colorlessness. He didn't enter through the main guest entrance. Instead, he parked near the far end of the property, beside the old service road, where deliveries came and went. A few employees milled about the back, loading dock, their movements sluggish, faces guarded. No one paid much attention to him, which was exactly what he wanted. A laminated badge reading temp staff, Macilides, hung from his belt. A fake title hastily arranged through a friend who still handled contracts for seasonal labor. As he adjusted the brim of his sun-beaten cap and headed toward the service entrance, Caleb caught a glimpse inside the staff break area. A cramped, fluorescent-lit room with dented lockers, sagging chairs, and a vending machine flashing an out-of-order sign. Voices inside were low, flat, heavy with fatigue. It hit him harder than he expected. Monroe Estates had once been a place of laughter and pride. Now it barely breathed. Caleb squared his shoulders. He wasn't here for speeches. He was here to work, to watch, to listen. The truth about what his family's dream had become wasn't buried in spreadsheets or polished presentations. It was here, behind the walls, where nobody thought the owner was looking. And today, Caleb Monroe was looking. He found her behind the tasting room, in the narrow passage where empty wine crates stacked higher than the doorway and broken glass crunched underfoot. Sienna Reyes, a slight figure barely out of her teens, struggled to balance a heavy tray of wine glasses, her hands trembling so hard that the glasses rattled against each other. Caleb slowed his steps, instinctively keeping back, watching. She bit her lower lip in concentration, but it didn't stop the thin sheen of tears from slipping down her cheeks. She blinked fast, as if she could will them away, but it was no use. The tray wobbled and a glass tipped over, shattering on the concrete with a sharp crack that echoed across the loading dock. Before Caleb could move, a door banged open behind him. Rick Dalton, the tasting room manager, stormed out, phone in one hand, irritation in the other. "For God's sake, Sienna, how hard is it to carry a tray? Clean it up and quit bawling. You're not 5. He didn't wait for a reply. He didn't even glance at her. He just walked away, still scrolling his phone. Sienna crouched down, hands fumbling for the broom tucked behind a trash bin, her shoulders curling inward like a wilting vine. Caleb stepped forward instinctively but stopped himself. He wasn't supposed to reveal anything yet. Not today. Instead, he watched as she swept up the shards with practiced efficiency, blinking back tears like she had done it 100 times before. This wasn't just a bad moment. This was routine, expected, invisible. A single tear slid off her cheek and landed silently among the broken glass. A detail Caleb knew he would never forget. It wasn't the sound of the shattering that stayed with him. It was the quiet afterward, the way her pain seemed so normal, here, like part of the day's labor. Standing there, hidden by a stack of crates, Caleb realized the glass wasn't the only thing breaking inside these walls. The real fracture was happening inside his people, the ones he'd been too absent to see. And now that he had seen it, he wouldn't look away. The more Caleb watched, the more the rot beneath Monroe Estates revealed itself. Not in loud disasters, but in the slow, grinding exhaustion that clung to every corner of the operation. The tasting room, once the crown jewel of the estate, felt hollow. Tables were left half-wiped, chairs, missing screws, teetered precariously on uneven floors, and the grand oak bar his grandfather had varnished by hand decades ago was now sticky with spills no one bothered to clean. Behind the scenes, things were worse. In the cramped kitchen, Owen, a wiry 17-year-old trying to work 2 jobs to help his family, wrestled with a dishwasher that wheezed and sprayed more steam into the room than water onto the plates. No gloves, no training. No one even pretended to help him. Caleb watched him struggle to stack glass racks properly, fumbling with raw, reddened fingers, while Rick leaned against the counter sipping an iced coffee, scrolling his phone. When Owen finally dropped a crate, sending a dozen plates skidding across the floor with a crash, Rick barked, "Maybe you're just not cut out for real work, kid." The words sliced sharper than any broken plate. Owen flushed crimson, bending quickly to clean up, no apology offered, no instruction given. In the staff break room, a dusty, outdated safety manual sat unopened on a table, ignored. Chemical bottles were left unmarked under the sinks. There was no training binder, no onboarding guide, just a few hastily printed schedules taped to the wall, already curling at the edges. No one here was set up to succeed. They were set up to survive. If they could. When Caleb asked quietly about breaks, an older cleaning woman named Linda Brooks just shook her head and muttered, "Clock out, keep working, that's the way." She said it without anger, without hope, just habit. Everywhere Caleb turned, he saw tiny acts of endurance, small rebellions against an invisible tide of neglect. Workers covering shifts with no notice, servers apologizing for mistakes that weren't their fault. Staff are learning to move faster, talk less, and hope not to be noticed. The problem wasn't that the young workers were lazy. The problem was they had been left to drown without a captain at the wheel. And the worst part? Caleb had trusted men like Rick and Mark to steer the ship. He hadn't just abandoned the vineyard. He had abandoned the people who were still fighting to keep it afloat. By the end of his first full shift, Caleb could barely meet his own reflection in the fogged glass of the tasting room window. It wasn't just exhaustion from the physical work. It was the steady, gnawing realization that he had failed them all long before today. Every ignored memo, every delegated responsibility, every time he'd told himself someone else will handle it, had carved deep cracks into the foundation his grandparents had poured their lives into. Caleb had thought he was honoring their legacy by growing the brand, expanding distribution, chasing bigger numbers. But standing there in borrowed boots, watching Owen scrape dried food off dishes with blistered hands, seeing Sienna's silent endurance behind a forced customer service smile, he knew the truth. He hadn't built anything worth saving. He had traded stewardship for strategy, leadership for convenience, pride for profit. The worst part was how easy it had been, how quickly the dream of Monroe Estates had been hollowed out once he stopped looking beneath the surface. The smiling quarterly reports, the polished executive briefings, all lies built on the backs of people who were barely hanging on. And he hadn't seen it because he hadn't bothered to look. As the last of the day's guests trickled out and the tasting room doors closed with a dull click, Caleb sat heavily on an overturned wine crate behind the kitchen. His hands, soft from years behind conference tables, ached from carrying crates and scrubbing trays. But it wasn't the physical pain that made him bow his head. It was the weight of responsibility. This wasn't Rick's failure alone. It wasn't Mark's carelessness alone. It was his. If Monroe Estates had rotted from the inside out, it was because Caleb Monroe had let the roots dry out. And if there was still anything left worth saving, if there was still any spirit left in this place, it would take more than a few firings to heal it. It would take rolling up his sleeves, staying in the dirt, and rebuilding trust, one broken promise at a time. Starting now, it all unraveled during the late afternoon wine tour, the biggest rush of the week. 36 guests arrived in staggered groups, each expecting a flawless tasting experience. The staff, already stretched thin, scrambled to keep up. Sienna juggled double sections without backup. Owen tripped trying to carry stacked trays, too heavy for one person. A spill at the bar went unattended for nearly 15 minutes. Rick, supposed to be managing the chaos, stood planted by the espresso machine, arms crossed, sipping his third iced coffee of the day. He barked orders when something went wrong, but never stepped in to help. Caleb caught snippets of Rick's complaints to another server. Kids today? Don't want to work, lazy, entitled. No pride. But Caleb could see clearly now the problem wasn't just attitude. It was abandonment. Rick had been promoted too fast, handed too much authority without any real leadership training. Mark, the regional director, had pushed him up the ladder to save costs, to fill the gaps fast during the expansion years. No one taught Rick how to mentor, how to build a team, how to listen. They just handed him keys and left him to sink or swim. And when Rick sank, he grabbed onto whatever he could. Blame, bullying, bitterness, dragging the younger workers down with him. The cracks in the system Caleb had built, cracks he'd once ignored for the sake of quarterly growth, now gaped open and swallowed everything in their path. The beautiful tasting room his grandparents had envisioned as a celebration of community had turned into a battlefield of survival. When a guest loudly complained that their tasting menu had been mixed up, white wine poured instead of red, no explanation given, Rick finally snapped, tossing a bar towel onto the counter and snapping, "Maybe if people knew how to read, it wouldn't be so hard." The room went dead silent. Sienna froze, mouth open. Owen nearly dropped another tray. Caleb set down the crate he'd been carrying and stepped forward, no longer just another invisible worker. He had seen enough. It was time to stop the bleeding. The moment Rick's words hung in the air, sharp and bitter, Caleb knew it was time. He stepped out from behind the counter, pulling the battered ball cap off his head. The entire room seemed to hold its breath. Staff stared, confused, guests paused mid-conversation. Sienna set down her tray, her hands trembling slightly. Owen's eyes widened as if he suddenly realized they hadn't been working with just another temp worker. Rick turned, scowling, ready to bark another order, and then froze. Caleb didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He simply said, "Enough." He let the silence stretch just long enough to settle into everyone's bones before he continued. "I'm Caleb Monroe. I own this place, and I've spent the last 3 days watching you treat my employees like they're disposable." Rick's face was drained of color. For a moment, he opened his mouth, maybe to deny it, maybe to excuse it. But Caleb shook his head once, and the words died in Rick's throat. "You're done here," Caleb said simply, effective immediately. The tasting room stayed eerily quiet. No gasps, no applause, just the heavy, aching relief of a wound finally being cleaned. Before Rick could even fully process it, Mark Phillips, the regional director, stormed into the room, clipboard in hand, eyes already narrowed. "What's going on here?" he demanded, trying to take control, with the same authority he always used in meetings. Caleb didn't give him the chance. He turned to face him fully. "You're just as much the problem, Mark," he said. "You've signed off on every report, every fake staffing number, every safety violation. You blamed the workers, you blamed the economy, but you never once looked in the mirror." Mark blustered, "You're making a mistake. It's a tough labor market. You can't expect leadership." "I expect leadership," Caleb interrupted, voice like steel. "I expect integrity, and I expect my people to be treated like human beings, not liabilities on a spreadsheet. If you can't live up to that, you're done here too." Mark's mouth worked silently for a moment, but he knew. He saw it in Caleb's eyes. There was no appeal, no second chance. Without another word, he dropped the clipboard onto the counter and walked out into the afternoon sun, defeated. Caleb turned back toward the staff, Sienna, Owen, Linda, all of them watching, cautious, uncertain, maybe even a little hopeful. "This isn't the end," Caleb said quietly. "It's the beginning, and this time we're doing it right." By the next morning, change arrived without fanfare. Diana Cole, a seasoned manager from another Monroe property, showed up at sunrise carrying nothing but a clipboard, a thermos of coffee, and a presence that immediately steadied the air. She didn't give a long speech or flash a corporate badge. Instead, she walked the floor quietly, speaking to each employee one-on-one. She asked who had missed breaks, who needed training, who felt overwhelmed. Within the first hour, schedules were restructured, not to punish but to protect. Sienna was pulled aside, not to be reprimanded but to be offered a real leadership track. Owen was enrolled in a paid training program with a formal mentor. Diana posted clear task lists near every workstation, stocked gloves and safety gear in the supply closet, and designated protected lunch breaks, no more clocking out and working unpaid. Most importantly, she listened. When Sienna suggested a small maintenance log for tracking recurring issues with equipment, Diana didn't just nod. She handed her a notebook and told her to start that very day. The atmosphere shifted faster than Caleb would have believed possible. The same staff who had been walking on eggshells 2 days ago now moved with purpose, tentative but building confidence with each task completed and each problem addressed openly. There were still gaps, still scars. Trust wouldn't rebuild overnight, but the foundation was finally, mercifully, starting to reset. From the sidelines, Caleb watched without interfering, pride and humility warring quietly inside him. This wasn't about sweeping declarations or dramatic overhauls. It was about small, stubborn acts of care, stitched together day after day. And for the first time in a long time, Monroe Estates was breathing again. The shift had just ended when Diana called the team into the break room. Not for another lecture, but for an open meeting. The overhead light still flickers, and the chairs still wobble, but something about the room felt sturdier, more awake. Caleb stood quietly near the door, arms crossed, letting Diana lead. She spoke briefly about next steps, hiring more staff, building structured training, setting a foundation that respected the people who made the vineyard possible. Then she paused. "If anyone has thoughts, now's the time to speak." Silence stretched at first, thick and uncertain. Workers glanced at each other. No one moved. Then, slowly, Sienna stepped forward. Her apron was still dusted with flour from the kitchen, her hair escaping its tie, but her back was straight, her hands steady. She looked around the room, at Owen, at Linda, at the newer hires still hovering nervously, and then she looked at Caleb. "It wasn't just that we were overworked," she said, voice soft but gaining strength with every word. "It's that no one cared if we broke." The room stayed frozen, breathless. Sienna pressed on, voice clear now. "We weren't lazy. We weren't entitled. We showed up, we stayed late, we took double shifts. We picked up the pieces when equipment failed, when guests yelled, when managers disappeared. We didn't need another motto on the wall. We needed someone to notice when we were drowning." Caleb felt something knot tightly in his chest. She wasn't accusing him directly, but she didn't have to. The truth hung heavy between them. "It wasn't about wanting praise," Sienna finished, her voice dipping softer, almost breaking. "It was about wanting to matter." No one clapped. No one needed to. In the quiet that followed, something shifted permanently. The foundation of the new Monroe estates wasn't going to be built on profits or expansion plans. It was going to be built on exactly what Sienna had just demanded: dignity, attention, and care. Caleb met her gaze and gave a slight nod. No speeches, no promises, just a vow he intended to keep, from the soil to the highest vine. Weeks later, Caleb stood once again at the overlook where the vines stretched wide and stubborn into the golden afternoon light. The land smelled the same, sun-warmed earth, distant salt on the breeze. But the feeling in his chest was different now. He wasn't here to mourn what had been lost. He was here to see what had survived. Below him, Monroe Estates bustled quietly. Workers moved with rhythm, not rush. Laughter echoed faintly from the crush pad where Owen was helping a new trainee rinse out barrels. At the tasting room entrance, Linda wiped down tables with steady hands, stopping now and then to chat with smiling guests. And at the front counter, clipboard in hand, stood Sienna. Her apron was clean, her steps sure. She checked inventory, coached a nervous new hire through a wine pour, and then caught Caleb's gaze through the window. She didn't freeze or shrink back like before, she just nodded, a small unspoken promise between them. "We're still here." Inside, a framed black and white photo of his grandparents had been rehung behind the tasting bar, newly polished. Caleb hadn't asked anyone to do it. Someone just had. That small gesture meant more to him than any balance sheet or expansion report ever could. The estate wasn't perfect. There were still shortages to manage, repairs to fund, policies to fix, but the heart was beating again. Strong, steady, patient, not because he had issued a memo or reorganized a department, but because he had stopped talking long enough to listen, because he had finally remembered that Monroe Estates wasn't built on wine or awards or profits. It was built on people. Caleb closed his eyes for a moment, letting the sun warm his face, the sounds of life filling the air. His grandparents' dream hadn't been lost after all. It had just been waiting, buried deep like an old vine, for someone to remember that roots don't thrive on ambition alone. They need care, presence, stewardship. When he opened his eyes, he smiled. Not the polished CEO smile, but the quiet, enduring smile of a man who finally understood the legacy he was meant to protect. And this time, he wasn't letting it slip away. The story of Caleb Monroe and Monroe Estates teaches a powerful lesson about leadership, legacy, and responsibility. True leadership isn't about titles, profits, or distant decisions made from conference rooms. It's about presence. It's about noticing the quiet struggles happening behind the scenes and caring enough to act. Caleb's journey reminds us that when leaders become too detached, systems decay, and good people are left to suffer in silence. By stepping down from his position of comfort and stepping into the real, daily lives of his workers, Caleb rediscovered the soul of his family's business, not in numbers, but in the faces of people like Sienna, Owen, and Linda. The vineyard's revival didn't come from grand gestures. It came from small, stubborn acts of attention, dignity, and trust, rebuilt day by day. The greatest legacy we leave behind isn't the empires we build. It's the lives we touch, the people we lift, and the humanity we preserve in the places we are entrusted to lead. True stewardship means staying close enough to hear the voices no one else notices and caring enough to make a difference when it matters most.